Have you ever considered making a podcast? Well, Spotify has a great platform that lets you make them very easily, distribute them everywhere. You can even earn money while doing so, and it's all in one place. And the best part, it's all for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and it's really simple to get started. So you record and edit your podcast right from your phone, your computer, whichever one that you like. And then when you publish them, they distribute your podcast directly to Spotify and also everywhere else that podcasts are heard. You can do video podcasts, you can interact with your audience with Q&As and polls. And once they're up and running, like I mentioned before, you can even earn money through your podcast in a variety of ways through things like ads and podcast subscriptions. And of course, it's totally free to use. There is no catch. When I started Plant School, I used Spotify for Podcasters, and I continue to use it because I love it. It's super easy to use, and it gives me everything that I need as a podcaster. So if you have ever wanted to start your own podcast, I highly recommend that you try out Spotify for Podcasters. You can download the app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started. Welcome to the Plant School podcast. I'm Rachel, and here we learn about plants, how to care for them, how they work, and I keep it simple and taught in a way that anyone from beginner to expert can enjoy. Join me in Plant School. Welcome to Plant School. I'm so glad that you are here and listening. Today, we're going to be doing an episode about monsteras. And I was going through my podcast and I realized, oh my goodness, I have not covered monsteras. That is the quintessential houseplant. How have I missed this? So I decided real quick that it was definitely time to do an episode on how to care for monsteras. So first of all, what is a monstera? It has a lot of nicknames, and especially so because there's quite a few different species of them. So you may commonly hear it referred to as the Swiss cheese plant, a split-leaf philodendron, which is not really an accurate name because it's not a philodendron. People also call it a cheese plant, fruit salad tree. The Monstera deliciosa in particular is called Mexican breadfruit or monster fruit. And then they are also called window leaf. There are so many names. I feel like I could go on, but I'm going to stop it there. But they are a vining plant, and they love to trail over a pot or climb along a stake or trellis. So most of the time, if you have one or if you know someone who has one, they are generally climbing a moss pole or something of the sort because they are a vining plant. They're a member of the Ariaceae family, and that family includes things like peace lilies and calla lilies, and also the pothos plant. And something kind of interesting about them is that no one really knows why they have holes in their leaves, but there are some theories. So I wanted to touch on that as we are, here describing what a monstera is. So some people believed that the tears in their leaves or the holes in their leaves were so that they could withstand high winds without tearing, because a lot of them are in tropical areas where you can get hurricanes, and birds of paradise do this. So they thought perhaps the monstera does this as well. And another thought was that it would make them look less desirable to eat. It already looks like someone has come along and taken a bite out of it, and so it might deter them away from eating it more. Another thought is that it allows more light to pass through the upper leaves and onto the lower leaves. Lastly, the fourth reason people think they have holes in their leaves is to allow more water to pass through and have contact with their roots. So currently, the theory that holds, the most value and the most weight is the one about light. So the holes in the leaves allow light to pass through those upper leaves onto their lower leaves. And I feel like this one makes the most sense when you think about other theories, especially. There are lots of plants that deal with hurricanes, and not all of them have split leaves. So if it was really necessary, a lot of plants would have adapted to have those split leaves as well, or have holes in their leaves. So that doesn't make too much sense. Water is not really scarce in tropical areas, so it wouldn't really make sense for them to need to have holes in their leaves so more water can get to their roots, because, again, they've got plenty of water in the areas that they live. So the light one seems to make the most sense. And this theory was developed by Christopher Muir at Indiana University. So the way he kind of went about this is he saw that understory plants, they really only need a few specks of light to survive. These plants that grow in tropical areas, they're very good at using the sunlight that they get. And so the holes in the leaves allow those speckles of light to come through to those lower leaves and would allow them to survive and allow the plant to thrive more. So that's kind of how this theory came about and why it holds some weight, more so than those other theories. So there's quite a few types or different species of monsteras. So as of 2022, there are 49 different species. All of them are accepted, tried and true, but most of these don't make it to your local nursery or hardware store. So really there's about 8 common varieties or species that you will find pretty frequently. Oftentimes the mini monstera is included with those common ones, but it's actually not a monstera at all. Why do we do this to ourselves? Like, its common name is not what it really is. So the mini monstera, its scientific name is Rhaphidophora tetrasperma. And monsteras, their scientific name, starts with monstera. That's literally their genus, whereas the mini monstera is not. So let's clear up that confusion for you today. So first and foremost, number 1, most common monstera is the Monstera deliciosa. Its species is called deliciosa because it produces Mexican breadfruit. I have not tried it, but I hear it tastes similar to a jackfruit or banana mixed with pineapple. Kind of looks like a scaly piece of corn on the cob, to be honest. If you guys have ever seen your peace lily flower, the flower looks very similar to a monstera's flower or fruit. And so it's like that middle part. It looks like a little corn on the cob in there. And it has these scales, and once they fall off, the plant is ripe and ready to eat. If you try and eat it beforehand, you will probably have an irritated mouth because this plant produces a lot of oxalates. Oxalates are actually really sharp. They're what make, what are they called? Gallbladder stones. So yeah, not fun. You do not want to eat it when it is not ripe. It's a no-go. And these plants, they do self-pollinate, which is really cool. So you don't necessarily need like a girl and boy monstera. They will self-pollinate themselves and create the fruit with just the one plant. And unfortunately, they do not usually flower and produce fruit indoors. It's just not an environment that's conducive to them being able to produce fruit. But wouldn't that be so fun if you could just have Mexican breadfruit growing in your living room? All right, so another monstera that's pretty common, I'm going to go through just a few of them just so you guys can get familiar with what types of monsteras are out there and what they're like. So there's the Monstera borsigiana, and it's very similar to the deliciosa, but it's a little bit smaller and it grows faster. There's the Monstera variegata, and they have white or cream variegation and tend to be pretty expensive. These other types of monsteras, these other species will also have variegation, but the variegata monstera, that's all it is a variegated monstera, which is pretty cool. There's the Monstera adansonii, and the holes on this monstera, they're pretty large. They take up about 50% of the leaf. So sometimes they're mislabeled as Monstera obliqua, and those plants are like extremely rare. There's the Monstera pinnati partita. That's kind of a fun one to say, but it's emerald green. They have slits on the leaves rather than holes. There's the Monstera Dubai, has very small heart-shaped leaves with dark and light green coloration, so it looks kind of different from most monsteras. There's the Monstera siltepecana, and it is a little bit harder to find. It has teardrop-shaped leaves. It's lighter in color. And lastly, there's the Monstera obliqua. And you're not usually going to find it, especially like at a hardware store, but it has a lot of holes. Like 90% of the leaf is holes, and they're pretty like paper thin leaves. So they're just very fragile. They've only been spotted 17 times in the wild. So obviously they exist more than that, just not in the wild, right? Mostly people producing them in a nursery or people producing them in their homes. After, researching all of these monsteras, I actually ran across one of my friends that I follow on Instagram, and she has a Monstera obliqua, and I was like, oh my gosh, I know that it's super rare because I was researching all these different monsteras, and it's really cool that she has one, and I understand that now. So now if you see someone who has one, you can feel that way too. So those are some of the more common types that you might see around. And of course, Monstera deliciosa being the most common one that you will see around, especially in like hardware stores or nurseries. So one of the questions I love to cover is, what is this plant's symbolic meaning? I always try and do this for each plant I do a care guide for. So the Monstera, it symbolizes long life. It can symbolize monster, which, yeah, we know where that comes from. Its name is Monstera. It can also symbolize mystery or suffocation. So kind of, I don't know, we've got long life, and then we kind of got these dark ones of monster, mystery, and suffocation. So if you gift this plant to someone, I hope you're trying to like give the vibe of long life and not of suffocation. That's pretty dark. But some of its folklore includes its names being Costilla di Adan and Costella di Adeo, which compares the leaves to the ribs of Adam. Just because of the way they look, it looks similar to a rib cage. And the aerial roots of the Monstera have been used for a long time. They've been used in basketry in Mexico and rope making in Peru. And moving on from that to, my next favorite question, maybe my most favorite question is, how did the Monstera get to where it is today? What is its history? And after I go through all of this, I promise I will get to how to care for a Monstera and how to keep yours alive if you have one, or if you get one, you can refer to this and how to keep it alive and healthy. So they can be found naturally, just in the wild, in Panama, southern Mexico, Southeast Asia, and most tropical regions of the Americas. Since they are vines, they are known to climb trees and grow up to 20 meters. That's about 65.5 feet. And in your home, they will not climb that much unless you have a giant house. No, you know what? They just won't. I don't think anyone has a big old tropical home that tall. But they can get up to 10 feet in your home. So this growing pattern that they have, it makes them what's called hemiepiphytes, and that is because part of their life cycle is spent in the canopy of, another plant. In this case, monsteras spend part of their life cycle in trees, and their roots can either be entirely up in the canopy or they can touch down into the soil. And these plants, they were introduced to Hawaii, Seychelles, Ascension Island, Society Islands. They've become mildly invasive there, but they've been used for a long time in their native countries. I mentioned their aerial roots, that are hanging there. They've been used for making ropes in Peru, baskets in Mexico, and in Martinique, which is an island located in the Eastern Caribbean Sea. They use the root for a remedy to treat snake bites, and there have been known cases of people using them as medicine to treat arthritis as well. So their history of being discovered is pretty interesting. Usually when I am researching an indoor plant and how they were found and kind of like classified and made known to the scientific world, it's pretty straightforward. But the Monstera, I had to do some digging. It has a really rich history, and I'm going to give you guys kind of the spark notes of this, which is saying something because I'm still giving you a lot. Just know that there was quite a bit more and a lot of like nitty-gritty details, but we're going to spare you those. So they are thought to be discovered in the 1700s. Some say it was the 1800s, but as I started digging, I realized where the confusion came from is because this plant in the beginning was not called a monstera. So the first recorded monstera, though it was not called that, was by a French botanist, Charles Plumier, which isn't that like the name of the feather duster guy on Beauty and the Beast? I gotta look it up. We're looking it up. Okay, Beauty and the Beast, feather duster, what's his name? Fifi. Oh, Oh, you know what, guys? I'm thinking of Lumiere, who's the candlestick man. Okay, okay, I was wrong. It's not the feather duster, that's a girl. But I don't know, Charles Plumier, very similar to Lumiere. So close, Charles. So, while Charles Plumier was in Martinique in 1693, he found the Monstera plant, and the natives were using it as a snake bite remedy, which I mentioned earlier. And so he named it, and the name he gave it was Arum hederaceum amplis folius perforatus. That is 5 words. Arum hederaceum amplis folius perforatus. Can you imagine you're like in your house, hey, what's this cool plant you have in the corner? Oh yeah, that's just my Arum hederaceum amplis folius perforatus. That is a mouthful. And just so you know, this was 1693. This was right before binomial nomenclature. And if you know anything about binomial nomenclature, that probably sounds familiar to you because it's usually in every science class. But Linnaeus was the one who created it and made it popular. He kind of went around and classified plants and gave them 2 names, a genus and a species. That was it. You know, they were all universally used. There's no common name. There's no 5-letter names, just 2, genus and species. And that is it. So a few years later, Linnaeus used Plumiere's description and illustrations of the Monstera to cite it and place it, and what he named it was Dracontium pertussum. There's a little bit of an error in doing this. The error was that Dracontiums, they have perfect flowers with a perianth, and the Monstera does not have that. But apparently it wasn't illustrated by Charles Plumier, and so Linnaeus didn't know that, and that's where it kind of sat for a while. You know, years passed, and in 1763, the name Monstera was first used by Addison, and he used it in his book, Familias des Plantes. And he was attempting to redescribe the genus Dracontium and give it a new name. He didn't mention what part of the plant really led him to the name Monstera, but I don't know, we can kind of assume maybe it was the leaves, perhaps the holes in the leaves reminded him of a monster. It's up to, I guess, your imagination because he didn't say why he did it. But within 70 years from Addison's publication in 1763, the Monstera had spread to Europe, and it could be found in seed catalogs. You could buy its seeds, but they were still listed as Dracontium pertussum, so Linnaeus's original name that he came up with. So Monstera had not caught on yet. Addison had described it as that and named it that, but no one else was using it. So it wasn't until 1830 when H.W. Schott of Vienna started to kind of lay the foundation of the Ariaceae family, which the Monstera is in, and he found that Monstera should be in this family. And he used the name from Addison instead of Linnaeus's original name. There weren't very many Monsteras known. So Monstera addisonii was the only true Monstera known at this time. And there were a few other ones, but they've been corrected since then and moved into different families, so I won't mention them. But that was the only one. And 10 years later, in the 1840s, the Monstera deliciosa was discovered. It was discovered by a scientist with the last name of Liebman. He found a Monstera deliciosa in Mexico. And Wurziewicz, he found one in Guatemala, and they each brought it back to their own countries, to Copenhagen and Berlin, respectively, and they started to spread throughout Europe. The Monstera deliciosa did, because it was a pretty easy plant to propagate. It was beautiful, it was big, and it's just a very unique plant. Throughout time, that was the 1840s, and moving on, way ahead to like the 1970s, they have always been around in the houseplant world. And in the 1970s, they really jumped in popularity. Largely, this fame is attributed to a man named Henry Matisse. You may have heard of him. He's a very famous artist, and he loved this plant. There's some very famous photos of him with a large Monstera in the background, and he created several art pieces inspired by the Monstera deliciosa. I decided to look at this picture that was famous in his artwork. The picture is literally just him like chilling in this armchair, and yeah, huge Monstera behind him. And his artwork is beautiful. It's very fun, very vibrant artwork. If you want to look it up, I think they would be really beautiful pieces to have in your home if you are a houseplant fan, which I think you would be because you're here listening to this podcast. And today, like I said, they're one of the world's most popular indoor plants, and you can find graphics of their leaves everywhere. I think I see more Monstera leaves more than any other leaf I can think of. It's just so unique, and when you see it, you immediately know what kind of plant that is, right? So you can find them on posters, pillows, socks. I know there's like keychains of them. And again, like I said, this popularity that they have is largely attributed to their easiness to grow. They're really easy to propagate, and they have a very distinct leaf pattern, and there's fun and rare varieties to keep houseplant enthusiasts, really involved. And speaking of those fun and rare varieties, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I kind of want to dive into just how expensive they can get, because since there are rare ones with like their variegation, or like the Monstera obliqua with hardly having really any leaf at all, they can get pretty pricey, and I'm gonna let you guys know just how pricey they can get.
This episode is brought to you by Honeysuckle White. If you're looking for ways to make mealtime healthier in the new year, make your favorite recipes with turkey from Honeysuckle White. Take the pressure off, keep it simple and tasty without sacrificing flavor for nutrition. Whether you want a delicious sandwich or post-workout protein, Honeysuckle White Turkey can do it all. Visit honeysucklewhite.com for recipe inspiration and to find retailers near you. Honeysuckle White. Eat what you love.
Oh my goodness, hello, it's me doing an ad for my own podcast. But I don't know if you guys know this, but this podcast, the Plant School podcast, is put on by me, myself, and I. No one is paying me to do this. I do it in my free time, and I greatly appreciate any support that you can give to keep this podcast going. So there are 3 ways that you can support this podcast. Number 1, you can share it with a friend. And if you do so, you actually enter into my giveaway. All you have to do is message me on Instagram at TinnyPlants and let me know that you shared it, and I will enter you in to win some really cool Plant School merch for free. Secondly, you can buy Plant School merch all on your own. We have some really cool plant-related shirts and stickers, as well as Plant School podcast-specific shirts and stickers. The link to my merch store can be found in the show notes of every single episode. And third option that you can do to support this podcast is to become a supporter. There is a link at the very bottom of the details of every episode of my podcast, and you can click that link to support the podcast and set up a monthly donation. It can be as low as $1 a month, or it can be, as high as you want. I won't tell you what to do. Any support that you can give is greatly appreciated. It allows me to spend my free time researching for you and helping you learn more about the plant world in a really fun and digestible way. I love doing this podcast, and I would really love your guys' help in sustaining it so that I can keep going with it for the long haul. Thank you. Alright, so just how expensive can Monsteras get? So just to show you like the very high end, here's some recent sales of rare Monsteras. So there was a Monstera Adansonii variegata. So it had a lot of, great variegation, and Adansonii doesn't have a whole lot of leaf to it. About 50% of the leaf is just the hulls, right? So it sold on eBay for $38,000. That is a big chunk of change for one plant. And then there was also a sale of a Monstera obliqua, the one that hardly has, any leaf at all. 90% of it is hulls. And that one sold for $23,000. And just like a note, The bonsais, like in the houseplant world, the bonsais are like still winning this game. There was a century-old white pine that sold for $1.3 million in Japan. So just like give you some context, monsteras are expensive, but there are more expensive plants. Bonsais just take the cake. And for good reason. They're beautiful. They are meticulously curated over years and years and years, centuries, like this one that sold for 1.3 million. So in general, if you're wanting to buy a rare variegated monstera or maybe like a monstera obliqua, prices range, right? So really nice ones that are variegated can be anywhere from like $700 up to $5,000. And just for all of you who are like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna own one, the average monstera, like a normal one, is usually around $15 up to like $50. Okay, so much more affordable. Don't worry that you won't be able to afford one. Not everyone is super extra and can afford, to just drop $38,000 on a monstera at Insonii. All right, so now let's dive into how to care for a monstera. So where should you be putting it in your home? They survive any temperature between 50 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 10 to 24 degrees Celsius, and they grow best if it's over 65 degrees. So just keep that in mind, that's 18 degrees Celsius. Low temperatures can kind of cause your monstera leaf tips to go brown. If you notice that, just keep in mind that it could be the temperature causing that problem. Make sure to give your monstera plenty of space to get large since they are rather large plants. Common sense, give it space because it's big. They prefer bright and direct sun. Only a few feet away from the window is ideal. Direct sunlight on a monstera is not recommended. Usually the leaves will burn, and if they get a little bit here and there, that's usually fine. Don't worry too much about it. And they actually do pretty well with artificial lights being added to the natural light coming from your windows. When it comes to watering, you want to water them once the soil is dry. So I mentioned this in every podcast episode, right? Just feel the soil. If those top few inches are feeling dry to the touch, your plant is ready for a drink. If it feels moist or damp, just wait a few days until it is ready for that drink of water. If you happen to overwater your plant, you can notice this when the leaves start to turn yellow and they wilt. To fix this, you reduce the amount of watering and you check for root rot. Root rot can be seen with black and mushy roots. You want to remove them and give them new soil if it's necessary. And that's if your plant is really struggling, you can tell it's turning yellow, it's wilting, it's in bad shape, there's sitting water in the pot, and you want to save it. You're going to take it out, remove the soil, cut off those roots that are black and mushy and give it new soil, and hopefully you will be able to save the plant. On the other hand, if you underwater the plant, it can cause the leaves to go limp and droop, and you want to give it water ASAP and keep a consistent watering schedule. In general, an inconsistent watering schedule can cause plants, to deal with things like brown tips, yellow leaves, things like that. So try your best to just water them regularly. For example, I went maybe a few days too long with one of my peace lilies. It got super droopy, and now a few of the leaves are all of a sudden yellow. And I am certain that this is because I let it go too long without water, and it's just kind of recovering, and a few leaves aren't going to make it. Not too worried about it, but just keep an eye on your plant and you'll catch on to things like that. Monsteras do love humidity, and they can get brown leaf tips if the air is too dry. So you can remedy this by providing a humidifier, or another great way is through a pebble tray. A pebble tray is simply some sort of dish with pebbles or leca or marbles and water added to it. That is it, just so that your plant can sit on top of those marbles, out of the water, and the water is going to slowly evaporate and provide humidity to that plant. All right, and moving on to fertilizing a monstera, you're going to want to fertilize your monstera once a month during active periods of growth. So if it's pushing out new leaves, you see it's growing a lot, this is the time that you want to fertilize. For a lot of people, that can be in springtime when the sun is starting to be out for longer periods of time. For other people, it can be winter when they're getting a lot of really great light in their south-facing windows. It just depends on where you live and what kind of window your plant is by. So when you do notice active growth, you're going to want to get a fertilizer that's a 20-20-20. That's the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium levels in your fertilizer. You literally can search on Google like 20-20-20 plant fertilizer and it'll come up. And not fertilizing your monstera can sometimes lead to yellowing leaves. I would say before jumping like, oh, my leaf is yellow, it must be fertilizer, I would look at other reasons first, but fertilizer can be a possible reason as well. Monsteras do deal with pests. They can often deal with mealybugs. Those are pretty common, especially on the undersides of the leaves. You can treat them with rubbing alcohol or neem oil. And spider mites can be common. I would try and wash off the spider mites, like put your monstera in the shower and try and hose them down, and then use neem oil or some other insecticide to get rid of the spider mites. Thrips, this can also happen with thrips. Again, you can wash those off in a shower and spray neem oil or some other insecticide onto your plant. And also they can deal with scale as well. And those can be treated by rubbing them directly off and treating with neem oil or some other insecticide of your choice. So how do you propagate a monstera? There are so many ways. This is one of the reasons why monsteras are so great. So you can use sections of the main stem, like without a leaf, just a section of the main stem. It does have to include a node. A node is kind of like a bump on the stem of a monstera. It is where those aerial roots start growing, and you can see it. Vining plants have these nodes on them because they can turn into aerial roots really quickly and hook on to things for them. This method is a little bit slower because it has no leaves to really help it grow fast. So I would say the most popular way to propagate a monstera is generally through a stem cutting, and that includes not only just the stem, but one or two leaves as well, and also a node. That is, you always need a node. If you don't have a node, there's no way for roots to just like magically appear. That node is where they are going to start and where they're gonna really take off. You can also propagate a monstera through air layering, which is a really fun way. What you do is you make a cut into the main stem of your monstera all around the stem. Like a circle around the stem, you're going to cut like a ring of plant tissue off. And then you are going to wrap around moss. I've used soil. It's just preference. And you're going to kind of like saran wrap this ball of moss or soil around this cut that you've made on the stem. You're going to want to water it and keep it moist. And you can keep it there through either tying strings on the top and bottom or some other way. And once you start noticing roots that are growing in there, you can go ahead and cut below the roots, of course. Please don't cut above the roots, then you just got rid of all your hard work. So cut below the roots and you have a rooted monstera that's ready to be repotted into soil. And I forgot to mention this, but with the stem cuttings, you can root those in soil or in water. It is up to you. You can also propagate them by seed, of course. And seeds germinate around 70 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 21 to 29 degrees Celsius. Of course, using seeds just takes incredibly long, especially when compared to something like a stem cutting where you're able to start with a lot of plant material, right? It's not just from a seed and starting from scratch. All right, and so moving on, what soil do monsteras need and how do you repot them? So they usually need repotting about every 2 years or so. It just depends on your plant. When you start noticing roots coming out the bottom, or there's just not a whole lot of soil in your pot, it's mostly roots, and you can tell that by the plant gets dried out very quickly. Like you water it and a few days later it's already dry, needing more water because there's hardly any soil left in there. So you can grab a pot that's just 1 to 2 inches larger and go ahead and kind of untangle the roots the best you can. If you break a few, that's fine. That will invigorate new growth, and then put it into that new pot. They have potting mixes specific to like tropical plants or even monsteras specifically, and you're welcome to use those. Those are great options. A general potting mix will usually work just fine, but a lot of people like to, have the tropical mix because they have things like coconut coir, peat moss, perlite, vermiculite added in bigger quantities than just the general potting mix. So if you do have a monstera, you may notice, the new leaves that come in, they don't have the holes in their leaves. They don't have the cut leaves, and it's actually not much to worry about when it is just those younger leaves that don't have holes in them. You just got to give it time, and you've got to be patient. If you have mature leaves that have no holes in them, that is a sign that your plant may be unhappy. So some ways to get more of these holes are called fenestrations. So to get more fenestrations, you want to make sure that the temperature is over 65 degrees, that's 18 degrees Celsius, and you want to make sure that it's being correctly watered, that it's being fed, and kind of all the things that we've talked about. Make sure like all the boxes are checked. In general, getting more light is usually the most common fix to this issue. You can cut the older leaves, which are the smaller ones, at the base of your plant, and that can encourage your plant to produce larger leaves with more fenestrations. And so if you are not sure how else to help your plant, that is one way to go about it. And lastly, just some extra care tips for monsteras. So you can trim their aerial roots because in general, they will start pushing out, especially if you have it on a pole or something like that. They're going to push out aerial roots to like grab onto so that they can climb because they are a climbing vine. And so yeah, if they get too crazy, you can tuck them back into the pot or you can trim them. And they respond really well to trimming, and it will actually help them push out new growth. So there's like an added benefit to taking care and trimming those aerial roots. Also, because their leaves are so large and big, it's a great idea to dust them. And I don't mean like dust them like get some dusting solution sprayed on a cloth and dust them, right? That's not a good idea for an indoor plant. Simply just get like a microfiber cloth and wipe them clean. I know a lot of people love to spray neem oil on the cloth to kind of like add an extra shine, and it's also an insecticidal protection for the plant in case there are any insects on it. But other than that, that's it. That's how you care for a monstera plant. I'm so glad you guys joined me today to learn more about them. I hope this was interesting to you, and I hope that you guys will be here next week to learn more about plants with me. Thank you for being here and listening today, and I hope you'll join me next week. If you'd like to support this podcast and keep it going, you can find the support link below in the description and donate. Or I have some awesome plant school merch, including stickers, shirts, and mugs, and the link to my shop is in the description as well. And if you don't want to spend any money but still support the podcast, share this podcast with a friend, either verbally or electronically. This will even qualify you for my giveaway. Just message me on Instagram at TinnyPlant that you shared the podcast with a friend, and you'll be entered in for a chance to win some goodies. Winners will be announced on the podcast. Again, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great week.